Guys, next up, I get to introduce one of the first people in psychedelics that I ever talked to, Dr. Joseph Tucker, the CEO and president of Enveric Biosciences. Dr. Tucker. Give it up for Dr. Tucker.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. It's the remote.
Go forward.
That's
red. This is forward, and this is back.
Oh, good. The microphone works. Hi, folks. Very nice to be here today. As Patrick said, I'm Dr. Joseph Tucker. I'm just going to make sure this actually works. Excellent. I thought that was a great panel we just had of very sophisticated investors. Certainly, I've spoken to a number of them thus far, and I can certainly agree with their perspective. I think actually they did a great job of saying many of the things that we believe at Enveric, and is how we have built the company. We are one of the biotech companies they were talking about that's working on developing new drugs, capturing intellectual property, and really looking at the world from a big pharma perspective. We're actually one of the few out there that is actually developing medicines in both the psychedelic medicine and the cannabinoid medicine sectors, and going for FDA, Health Canada, similar approval. But importantly, we have a very important asset in the company that I'm going to talk about in a moment that allows us to generate really these new drug candidates and the intellectual property that we hope is going to have a very big footprint in the industry. Now, we are all long-standing drug developers. I'm a scientist by training. You can see me top left. Been, started as a biochemist and a molecular biologist, but I've been a drug developer the last 20 years. A couple of the other folks on this slide, Dr. Bob Dogger, Chief Medical Officer, originally a psychiatrist, practicing psychiatrist, but he has been developing mental health drugs, starting companies as I have, and getting them successfully acquired by Big Pharma. Last person on the slide I'll mention is Dr. Peter Ficini, who is a real leader in this space of creating new molecules inspired by nature, and we're talking scheduled drugs. He started in opiates. He's actually the first guy to sequence the opium poppy genome, for example, but also in cannabinoids, and now psychedelics, has made an entire career out of creating new drugs in this sector. So at Enveric, it's actually the coming together of two companies, originally a cannabinoid medicine company and a psychedelic medicine company, which I had started up in Canada. I'm originally a Canadian, but living now in the Boston area. So we have combined the portfolios, the pipelines of those companies. We have two cannabinoid assets moving towards the clinic in glioblastoma, radiation dermatitis, and we actually have a very strong focus in the psychedelic medicine, initially in cancer-related distress. So we have a number of programs going there, again, moving quickly towards the clinic, and I'll talk about them in a second. So I thought there was a great point from the last group talking about the receptors, targeting different receptors, and that's something to pay attention to in the psychedelic sector, where very often people say, well, we're trying to create a hallucinogenic effect, we're trying to target 5-HT2A, but the reality is there's 14 serotonin, that's 5-HT, there's 14 different 5-HT receptors. The other 13 are all already targets for approved drugs. So if what you're doing, which is what we're doing, is creating a very large portfolio of new chemical entities, new drugs that target the serotonin receptors, yes, you can start with the psychedelic sector, but there are numerous other indications you can also pursue with those new molecules. So I'm going to talk extremely briefly. I think we're all here because we understand this sector is in the early days of the validation. Spravato now approved, FDA now granting breakthrough status, and big investors like the folks that were just here are starting to get behind some of the leading companies in this space. And we also heard a little bit on the sector on how do you really try to understand the modality. We heard people saying there's psychotherapy, it's not psychotherapy. So here's the way, I'm a scientist. Here's how I think about it. Those initial molecules, the classic molecules that come from nature, or maybe a slight derivation, a slight change that induces a hallucinogenic effect, that's a boost to psychotherapy. And so that's your in-clinic model. Maybe it's an 8-hour session, or maybe you have to do IV. You need 2 service providers with you. It's all a very confining from the market point of view way to deliver therapy. I think that for some indications, it probably may well be the very best way. But as we also heard, the big win, where the future is coming, and frankly, what big pharma is most interested in, is the next generation of molecules where not only are they novel, but you can now take away things like the hallucinogenic effect. You can dial down the length of the trip and things like that. So we're very interested in that. Again, the folks up here were talking, giving you the names of the big companies. Big companies are mostly working on old molecules, very difficult to protect. They've been around 20 years, or in some cases, they're from nature, actually. So those are very difficult to patent protect. You're not supposed to be able to patent protect things from nature. So what do we do at Enveric? This, honestly, folks, this is the key engine that is driving the molecules we're creating and the IP that we're generating, something we call the Cybrary. And it's something that I think, honestly, we're the only ones out there that can really claim to be able to do this well. We're combining 2 technologies, synthetic biology and chemistry, which don't usually go together. We have managed to put them together, and that's allowed us to create all these new drugs that nature never tried creating, and chemists were unable to create because it was very costly, very difficult, very time-consuming. And so how does that work, right? We've created, actually, we filed quite a few patents now, claiming literally millions of new drug candidates that we're looking to develop. And so, I'm a scientist, I'm sorry, very, very briefly, what does that mean? So imagine that molecule, that's actually psilocin. We heard from one of the companies earlier today, that's sort of your psilocin structure, your DMT structure, and it's got decorations on the outside. So if you can modify those decorations on the outside, you can change the way that key fits in the lock in the body, and you can now change what the activity is like in the patient. You can change the side effects, and you can change the benefit. Because we've created so many of these things, it could take us a very long time actually to go through your classic drug development process. So we've had to bring in artificial intelligence. We've had to bring in a second cutting edge technology. We actually had to bring 2 different service providers that create AI and develop some internally. So all 3 together, we ultimately put together a tool that allows us to screen through these many, many molecules we make and come up with the ones that we think have the highest likelihood of proceeding. So where's our initial cancer-related distress I mentioned earlier is our lead program. For those of you that don't know it, so it's not in the DSM yet, but it will be soon. Watch for it. This is an indication that something like 40% of cancer patients actually have anxiety, depression, trauma that rises to the level of mental health diagnosis and requires an intervention. We've seen, again, we heard earlier today, some great academic work at places like Johns Hopkins, and academic work is a fantastic place to start, opens up new venues, but ultimately a company needs to come along, apply the appropriate rigor for the FDA, and carry it to the finish line. So we have actually several different generations of cancer-related distress molecules that we picked out of our Cybrary that we're moving forward. Interestingly, we have one which is a hallucinogenic type, a psychedelic type, that is our Gen 2. And then Gen 3 coming along behind it, we have a lot of optimism for. This is pursuing a non-hallucinogenic molecule. Can you deliver the same benefit or similar benefit with a non-hallucinogenic molecule? If you can, as we heard from the investors just now, that market is much, much bigger, and big pharma's interest, frankly, is much larger as well. Not to belittle the cannabinoid side of the house, just mentioning one of the programs. So we have multiple programs going on. One of the programs going on the cannabinoid side of the house is, and we heard for a very good reason, you've seen very little in the way of drug development in cannabinoids. There's a number of reasons for it, but we've addressed those issues by coming with a topical administration, sidestepping many of the side effects that you see with cannabinoids, and we're coming up with a topical to treat Again, cancer patients, radiation dermatitis is something that affects almost half of all cancer patients. So you can see we're going after very large market opportunities initially here at Enveric on both sides. And yes, we are NASDAQ traded, one of that small number of NASDAQ traded companies. Ticker symbol you see, ENVB. Right now we're sitting on a bit more than 25 million in cash, done a few raises this past year, and you can see the shares outstanding as well. The most important thing, and exactly as we heard from that last panel, is the access to capital. If we were Canadian listed, if we were private, we'd have a lot of difficulty accessing capital. But being on the NASDAQ, we know that we can tap those markets when we need to. Finally, I'll end off with our catalysts and milestones. And the only thing I'm going to say, 2021 was a foundational year for us. It was actually the bringing together of the cannabinoid and the psychedelics company to form Enveric. But in 2022, what we're looking at doing is moving several of our psychedelic medicines towards the clinic to get into IND filing so that we should get into clinical trials next year. And similarly, on the cannabinoid side of the house, the first one should be in clinical trials this year and the second the year after that. So this is going to be a real inflection point year for us as we go to a clinical stage with multiple products, both psychedelics and cannabinoids. And I think most importantly, validating this patent asset that we've created, this large portfolio, new drug candidates, owning a lot of intellectual property in this space, something that we hope will be very interesting to big pharma as this market turns in the next few years. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for everybody for your attention.